Who are the gospel authors? Can we be confident that we really know who they are? And why did they write them? Were they seeking great fame and glory? Did the disciples just use the most popular names to attach to these writings to help sell their story? Is the deity of Jesus just a legend that got added to the story over time? And what about these other gospels that got rejected by the church? All coming up today on the Way, Truth, and Life podcast. Now that we've established the historical existence of Jesus from all extra biblical sources, I want to start this episode off with a question. Why is it that when it comes to Jesus, we all of a sudden don't want to go to the closest, most accurate source material to learn about him? For example, if we want to learn about the Holocaust and what really took place in the concentration camps, we would go to the writings and stories of Holocaust survivors to get the most trustworthy and accurate information. We're not going to go to the writings of Hitler or the Nazis if we want to learn the truth about what took place inside of the concentration camps. And this would be the same thing for other religions, right? If I want to learn about Muhammad, I'm going to read the Quran. I'm going to go to the Hadiths. I'm going to look at the Tafsir. If I want to learn about what he taught, the type of character he had, the way he led his life, these are the things I'm going to go to. I'm going to go to the source material to learn about Muhammad. Why, when we get to Jesus, all of a sudden it's different? First off, let's see what the Bible is. The Bible is a compilation of books divided up into the Old Testament and the New Testament. So the Old Testament consists of the Torah and all of the prophets, right? So it goes from the story of creation all the way up to the prophet Malachi, which ends, I believe, about 400-ish years before Jesus. And this is what the non-Messianic Jews hold to, right? The Old Testament. The New Testament is when Jesus comes onto the scene and everything after that. So the Gospels would be the first 4 books of the New Testament detailing the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. So when were the Gospels written? Most historians have Matthew and Mark coming somewhere between the years 40 and 50 AD, and Luke and John coming somewhere between the years 50 and 70 AD. With the last gospel being written, likely John. One of the major factors in the dating of the Gospels, but specifically the Gospel of John, is the collapse of the Second Temple in Jerusalem, which we know occurred in the year 70 AD. And all 4 gospel accounts are written from the perspective that this temple is still standing. Therefore, it is very likely that John also came before the collapse of the temple in the year 70 AD. Now, Jesus was crucified in the year either 30 or 33 AD. There's some debate about that. So you may be thinking, wow, the earliest gospel account doesn't come from 10 to 15 years after Jesus' crucifixion. While true, we have to keep in mind that this was not happening in the year 2025 as we live in today. So when we look at the dating of the Gospels, we have to look at this through the lens of the time period in which we are discussing. And for ancient times, this is actually extremely fast. For example, when you compare this to the earliest writings that we have of Alexander the Great, those earliest writings don't come until 400 years after Alexander the Great's time. So compare 400 years with 10 to 15 years, it's pretty fast. And another quick fun fact, Jesus has just as many major writings about him as the Roman emperor of the same time. So just as Jesus has 4 major writings written about him, the Emperor Tiberius Caesar has 4 major works written about his life as well. This is a huge deal for a Jewish man coming from the small town of Nazareth to have just as many major writings written about his life as the Roman emperor of the same time period. Wow. So how do we know who wrote the Gospels? Well, the short answer is that It's never been contested. So no one ever came along and said, hey, you know what? I actually wrote that. It wasn't Matthew. Or I actually wrote that, not Luke. Truth is that during this time period, all of the eyewitnesses are still alive. Everybody saw what happened. So anyone who tried to just come and write some random forgery or make up a story is pretty easily debunked.
Oh, that makes so much sense.
Anybody can't just come and write up an account of the events that took place, right? And there is a myth that exists that the Gospels were anonymous, and this is just simply not true.
Erroneous! Erroneous!
The Gospels never were anonymous. Everyone knew who the Gospel authors were, and there is not a single manuscript that exists that does not have the Gospel attributed to Matthew, the Gospel attributed to Mark, the Gospel attributed to Luke, the Gospel attributed to John on it. And the early church fathers unanimously attribute the authorship, and at the time in the global ancient world, there is unanimous harmony of who the authorship is. Their writing styles give more evidence to this too. For example, the book of Matthew, we know that he was a tax collector, and his gospel account uses more currency terms than anyone else by far.
Here, some allowance.
And Luke, we know, was a physician, and this is evidenced in his meticulous writing style and how he paid very close attention to detail in his writings, which we'll get into in another episode talking about archaeological evidence from Luke's gospel. So we'll get into some of the theories, right? Some people may ask, oh, well, they just use these names to give more credence so that more people would believe the stories. They use these names, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, to get people to believe it. And this is just simply not true, right?
That's not true.
If you were going to go that route, these are not the names you use, aside from maybe John. While Matthew was a direct eyewitness and apostle of Jesus, he very well may have been the least liked of the 12 apostles. Remember, he betrayed his Jewish brothers and sisters by going to work for the Romans, and he was a tax collector, so he's collecting taxes from his fellow Jewish companions, so he's probably not very well liked. This is not a name that you would use if you want to just help sell your cause to circulate.
Save your money, pay your taxes, don't go to jail.
Next up, you have Mark and Luke, who were not direct eyewitnesses of Jesus. Mark was a follower of the apostle Peter, and Luke was a follower of the apostle Paul. So they are direct accounts of first-hand eyewitnesses, but they themselves were not eyewitnesses. So these are not names that you would use to help circulate your cause either. The only gospel you could make this argument for is John, because he was a direct eyewitness to Jesus. He was an apostle of Jesus, and not only was he an apostle, but he was a part of Jesus's inner circle of apostles and likely his favorite. Did they choose to write the gospel seeking fame? This is very unlikely. Remember, this is during a time where Christians were being severely persecuted, so it's not exactly the best idea to write up an account and have it circulating with your name attached to it. It's kind of like putting a big red target on your back. Also, when you read the Gospels, not only were they not writing for fame, you can see the honesty that they were trying to portray in their writings. For example, you have women finding the empty tomb first. This is a big deal for first century Judea, when women's voices were not valued at all. They were not even allowed to give testimony during this time period. That's how little the voices of women were valued. The fact that they all write women find the tomb first is a good indicator that they were just simply trying to be honest with their writings. This is an embarrassing detail for the gospel authors. Women finding the tomb first instead of one of the 12 apostles. And all throughout the gospels, you find other embarrassing details, such as Peter's denial of Jesus. Peter, when he was walking on water, how he started to sink because he lacked faith. You have the apostles constantly not understanding what the heck Jesus is talking about during a lot of his sermons.
What the heck does that mean?
And Jesus is constantly having to go back and break it down for them line by line, bar for bar.
Yeah, Drake! Drake!
And you have Luke right off the bat in his gospel saying, hey, I am not an eyewitness. However, I went and got an orderly account. So Luke, being the meticulous physician that he was, went around interviewing a countless amount of eyewitnesses and put together an orderly account to present to Theophilus, which is who he addresses his gospel to. As a traveling companion of Paul, most historians believe that Luke wrote his gospel in order to get an orderly account to present to Theophilus, while Paul is likely in prison in order to get Paul freed. In other words, he's trying to get Paul's captors to understand that Paul is not lying, that he's telling the truth about what happened. And Luke goes on to write the book of Acts as well. Another interesting detail is John recording that water and blood came out when the Roman soldier pierced Jesus' side after he was dead on the cross.
That's basically as bad as you can get.
In 1986, the American Medical Association published an article examining the physical death of Jesus. In their examination, they explained how this could happen due to hypovolemic shock caused by blood loss from the scourging and crucifixion, and how this could lead to the accumulation of fluid in the pericardial sac around the heart and the pleural space around the lungs. This is what they would expect to see. And this is pretty interesting because 2,000 years ago, when John would have had no idea of these medical terms, no idea what's going on, he just simply records what he sees, hoping that some point down the line, this may be of some significance. Another common objection is Jesus' divinity simply being a byproduct of legend grown over time, and this just simply is not true. While the Gospels do come a little bit later, the Gospels are not the earliest writings that we have on Jesus. The earliest writing we have actually come from the Apostle Paul's letters, and in 1 Corinthians, Paul's creed, he writes, "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. Historians date this to around 3 years of Jesus' crucifixion, so this shows that within 3 years, Jesus' divinity was already a thing. They already worshipped him as God.
Say what?
Speaking of legends, what about these other gospels that got rejected by the church, such as the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene? How come these got thrown out? That seems a little sketch.
Now it sounds incredibly sketchy.
Historians say they expect anywhere from 50 to 100 years for legend to form, and ironically, that is exactly around the time period that we start to see these Gnostic Gospels come onto the scene in the late 1st and mid 2nd centuries. So these Gospels come way later, and while they have the names of some of the popular apostles and disciples of Jesus, such as Thomas, Peter, and Mary Magdalene, they're not written by them. Peter, Thomas, Mary Magdalene, they've been dead for decades at this point, and this is why they were rejected by the early church. Not because of some big conspiracy, it's because they're not authentic. And the church fathers were very careful and very meticulous in what they allowed in as scripture. So you had to be either a direct eyewitness or a first-hand eyewitness to an apostle for them to take it seriously.
That's fair to say.
And on top of that, they can just look at the contents and tell that it didn't line up with everything else we knew to be the truth of Jesus, everything else we knew to be the truth of the apostles and disciples and what they were teaching. For example, let's look at the Gospel of Thomas and what it says about women. In the Gospel of Thomas 1:14:1, it says, "Simon Peter said to them, 'Let Mary come out from us, because women are not worthy of life.'
Yikes.
And Jesus said, 'Behold, I will draw her so that I might make her male, so that she also might be a living spirit resembling you males. For every woman who makes herself a male will enter the kingdom of heaven.'" So does that sound like anything Jesus is known to have said? So this is very easy to tell that it's a forgery and the church fathers just threw it out. And also notice the difference in the name choice for these fake gospels that came out, how they used the name of Thomas, Peter, Mary Magdalene, very popular names, on the contrary to the actual gospels that were written, further adding evidence to my point earlier about the original authors' names not being used to add legend.
Checkmate.
But that's it for this episode, guys. We've still got a few left in this Evidence for Jesus series, but we are about to wrap it up soon and move into some of these biblical prophecies and start studying some of that. So I look forward to seeing y'all next time. As always, thank you for watching. I'm your host, Brandon.